Hi, I'm Chris Ippolito, and welcome to the Get Coached podcast, where I'm documenting my journey from employee to entrepreneur while featuring the coaches that are helping me along the way. Each episode, these coaches provide actionable advice to help me and you, the audience, find more success as entrepreneurs. I invite you to join the journey so we can go and grow together. Welcome to another episode of the Get Coached podcast. This is a bonus episode I wanted to get out there to help anyone who finds themselves looking for work because of the COVID-19 crisis. I sat down with Cassandra Carlsson, who is a career coach and HR consultant, and we talked about how to be more successful when looking for a new job. Please enjoy this conversation with Cassandra Carlsson. Hi, Cassandra.
Hi, Chris.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Welcome to the Get Coach podcast. Glad to have you here because this is a conversation I wanted to have. I've actually been wanting to have this for a while due to some situations some friends of mine have been going through, but I pushed it forward a little bit because of what the whole world is going through.
Right.
So I'd love if you could share a little bit about who you are and what you do now. And I think people will understand why I invited you to be a guest on the show.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Super excited. So my name's Cassandra, like you said, and I'm a career coach and consultant. So what I do basically is I help people create careers that they really love. And basically, help people get out of that feeling of, Monday morning, you don't want to go to work. And I think we've all experienced that in some way or another. It comes and goes. But for those people who really feel that consistently, that's, we spend about a third of our lives at work. So that's not something that I want for people. And I'm really passionate about that. So that's what I do. You asked me about how I got to this?
Yeah. Tell me, what's your story? How did you become a career coach?
Right. So I think I've always been really passionate about work. I've always had this drive that I really want to love what I do. But I haven't necessarily always known the ingredients to what it takes to really love your job and love your work life. So I've actually jumped around quite a bit. I actually started out as a pilot. That was my first career. And I did that for quite some years. I flew around in Europe and in Sweden until I kind of realized that, you know what, I'm a lot more interested in the people doing the flying than the actual flying itself. So that kind of led me into psychology, and eventually I graduated with a master's in management and human resources. So I did that. I've been doing that ever since. And I've had numerous jobs. I've had numerous roles. I've worked for a bunch of different companies in different capacities. And I kind of kept coming up to the same point where I was successful, but not necessarily fulfilled.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I kind of took the help of a coach who helped me and guided me along to kind of find that sweet spot of, what kind of skills do I want to use, my natural talents versus what's the environment that I want to do it in, and also what's the impact that I want to make, and kind of to get those to come together. And that's where I found myself today, and I'm helping people do the same thing.
That's a noble cause, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of people who they get stuck in a job and they feel almost imprisoned because debt, obligations, whatever it is, and because it pays them well, the term the golden handcuffs. Can you think of certain moments in time through your journey that were almost like epiphany moments where it just kind of all of a sudden clicked and you're like, I need to be doing something different, or this isn't quite the right thing for me? Any stories that you can think of?
Oh, I have a lot of different ones. But I think the first one that like really clicked for me was just back in the day when I was still flying. And I was sitting up in the air and I was on a mission doing photography flights. And I just realized that I was, pretty bored. And it just wasn't, I realized that I was doing it more for someone else than for me. So there was no real joy in the actual assignments. I remember feeling quite scared every time I went up there because I had to work really hard. I wasn't really working with what I was naturally good at.
Mm.
And also, I remember fighting quite hard with myself to be like, why am I actually doing this? What's the impact that I'm making with this? And that happened to me several times during my career where I was like, I know that what I am doing is important, but I don't feel it. It's not aligned with what I want to contribute and what the impact that I want to be making. So yeah, that was one of those moments when I was sitting there like thousands of feet up and I was like looking down. I'm like, what am I doing here?
You said mission and assignment. So were you military?
No.
No.
But I was doing photo flights. So I was actually photographing
Okay.
military bases at that time, but it was more for
Ah,
maps and that kind of stuff.
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. What kind of aircrafts were you flying?
Oh, I had all kinds of different ones. I think that one was called, oh, you know what? The name escapes me. I don't know the name of it. It was a double propeller airplane. It
Okay.
was a wonderful aircraft, but the name is gone. Sorry, it
Yeah.
was a
No,
while
that's
back.
okay. I'm curious if it was like prop planes, or did you ever fly jets, or was it prop planes primarily?
It was prop planes primarily. I was
Yeah.
certified for it, but I never flew professionally jet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is that something you would want to do? Is it kind of like on your bucket list to maybe do one day?
No.
No? Oh,
No, well,
I
people ask me a lot if I miss it, and I'm like, yeah, I came to the point where I don't.
yeah. My
Yeah.
my father was an aircraft mechanic in the
Oh, wow.
military, so he got to go and ride along in a
Mm.
jet. And I remember him telling me that he wasn't able to hold his lunch down when he
Oh,
did it.
wow.
So, but I think that would be something that would be quite an experience. I think I'd like to do that one day. One of my favorite movies from back in the day was Top Gun. So for me,
Oh, I'm
it would
with you.
just it would just remind me of that, and I would kind of nerd out a little bit. But
Yeah,
um,
totally.
so when you made that decision to find a coach, because obviously that's a big theme of this podcast, is to
Hmm.
help people understand that that's a really key and common step for a lot of successful people. And again, success is defined in many different ways. But
Sure, yeah.
when you ultimately made that decision, what what were some of the influences around that decision, if you can remember? Was it books? Was it other, like, association, podcasts? What were some of those influences?
Right. Well, I think that's a really good question. So I think I've always been really interested in personal development. So I was, associated with the term of a coach. And I think for me, it immediately sprung from just like, okay, if you don't know what to do, a coach can help you sort out those thoughts. So my influences were primarily books and just a general interest that I took in personal development. Yeah.
Right. Do you remember some of the books? Do you, like,
Um,
what would be some of the books that were the most influential for you?
well, I think at that time I had just read Simon Sinek's
Oh,
Find Your Why.
start with why, or
Yeah.
yeah, start with
Yeah.
why. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was really, because I was searching for, why am I doing these things, trying to find the purpose and stuff like that. So that was one of the books that I remember really resonated with me.
Yeah.
Um, what other good books about coaching had I read at that time? I'm going to stop with that. That's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. That one comes up quite regularly. So when you read that book, it helps you determine your why, your purpose, like what you wanted to pursue. Then you made the decision to find a coach, and then that kind of helped you transition to what you do, which is coaching and other things. I know there are other things that you do. um you had mentioned on our previous call that one of the first steps you do when you're helping somebody with career coaching is a little bit more around mindset, and perhaps even helping them discover their why. Do you mind
Yeah.
sharing a little bit around kind of what your process, or how that conversation kind of sounds with people?
Yeah. So when I work as a coach, it's really a lot about finding out what you want as an individual. And obviously, that's going to be different for everyone. But I think that's really the start of everything, because as human beings, you know, we're influenced by so many different things from the outside world. And it's easy to kind of become lost in like all the shoulds and, you know, the pressures from the outside. What should I be doing? What does my mom think? What does this cool movie Top Gun say that I should be doing? And so that's kind of where it all starts with my clients, to really figure out, well, who are you and what is important to you? What does a fulfilling life look like to you? And really helping them to guide through that and find those answers for themselves.
Right.
And it really starts with a vision. What is it that you want? What does that future, what does that dream look like for you?
Yeah. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, a big part of the reason why I wanted to have somebody like you as a guest was because just some friends and their desire to perhaps make career changes and get away from that type of work where they're just not feeling fulfilled. But then we went through a pandemic. So depending on when this episode comes out, we might still be in it, or we're over, or whatever it be. And there's a lot of people in the world who are going to be in positions where they are without employment. So
Yeah.
obviously some career coaching advice will be beneficial to them. Or they through when events like this happen, I think it makes people start reflecting more, right? So they're going to
Yeah.
look at their current careers, whether if they were one of some of the fortunate few who were able to maintain their positions and weren't impacted by the downsizing and a lot of what happened. But now they're going to look at this and go, is this really what I want to be doing? Am I feeling fulfilled? So
Yeah.
I was hoping we could dig into that a little bit, as far as obviously we talked about where you would start, but what would be some advice and guidance that you would give on, maybe let's start with resumes. Do you have any tips as far as how somebody could brush up their resume, or just some common mistakes that maybe you see people are making when it comes to their resume?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, if we start at the very start, like the first thing you need to do is really figure out, okay, what is it that you want to do and why do you want to do it? And what's the value that you actually bring? And then this needs to go into a story. So like that needs to translate into communication, which, you know, like you say, that goes into a resume, that goes into a cover letter, that goes into your online presence, you know, if you're on LinkedIn or if you have a professional website. So my first advice is to really get your story together and look at all those things. What is it that you want? Why do you want it? And what's the value that you bring? And if we're going to zoom in on the resume, first, the thing I would say, because I've worked in HR a lot, I work with recruitment a lot, and as a recruiter, I can say I generally spend like 30 seconds to maybe a minute and a half looking at your resume.
I've heard that before.
Unfortunately, but that's
Yeah.
kind of what it looks like. So what I would say to you there, that's why it's so important that you know your story and what you're about, because your resume needs to be really clear and concise.
Mm-hmm.
So first thing you need to do is look at the format. There are so many resources out there, templates that make it really simple for you. and just make sure that it's very clear that, you know, what you did, between when periods of times did you do it, and make it very short and concise. Use bullet points to describe what kind of results you created. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I'd heard the statement that a lot of HR personnel, they quickly look at resumes. So it's from the perspective of a job seeker, that can be really frustrating because you invest all this time into this resume, and then you
Right.
find out that the majority of HR personnel are just quickly scanning it and they're looking for something, right? So
Hmm.
do you have especially because you've worked in that capacity and then now coach people, is there something
Yeah.
that people can include in that resume or the cover letter that kind of grabs people's attention to make them stop and perhaps take a little bit more time to read their resume and hopefully increase their chances of getting to that next stage of the interview?
Right. So I think like maybe a misconception is that just because we take so little time, we don't actually get what's important. But if you have crafted a good resume, that will, like, we will see what is important. So that's why it needs to be really clear. Because, you know, long lines of text doesn't necessarily translate into, you know, the important thing. So
Right.
that's why you need to distill it to really make it really concise. So my advice would be to really look at your bullet points to make sure that those reflect what you contributed. So
Mm,
you don't want to just like ramble up stuff like, okay, I um, was like your assignments.
right.
Think of it more of like, okay, what was the value you contributed? You can also look at how you word things. You can exchange manage for directed. Small stuff like that that takes out the cliches and make it really clear what
Right.
it is that you actually contributed, the value that you brought.
Right. Okay.
Um, Bringing some numbers and results is also usually pretty good.
Yeah, I
Uh,
guess numbers would make a lot of sense because those would probably stand out more, right? And actually
yeah,
putting the numbers and not writing out the actual, like the word of the number.
exactly. And try not to make it like a story. Just, you know, bullet points is usually a lot better.
So this was a few years ago for me when I went to a recruiter and what their suggestion was, actually it wasn't just them. I kind of found some things online. So as far as like what that resume would look like is, so your name, your kind of information near the top. And then there
Exactly.
was underneath that a paragraph where it was, um, the suggestion was a career summary. So that
Mm,
portion was kind of my story in my own words, and then
mm,
below that was the work experience, all the different companies I worked for, the time I was there, and
mhm.
then the bullet points.
Yeah.
Is that summary part, is that something that you would normally recommend or of value when an HR recruiter is typically going to scan? Is that maybe where they'll go next if they're like, oh, I want to learn more, and then they go to that summary, or would you just say don't even bother including it?
So I think it depends on what your career story looks like. Usually, where I go first is that I look at the titles, I look at what you've done, and if it doesn't make sense, I will look at your summary. So I
Okay.
would say it's a good idea for people who maybe have shifted careers a lot, or people who are looking to make a transition into a new field, to use that kind of summary space to kind of explain that, okay, I've been an engineer all my life, and now I'm going to be a career coach.
Right. Okay.
So that's a good space to kind of just get the recruiter understanding, like, oh, why is this person applying for this? Because it's an engineer.
Right.
Um, or if you have big gaps, to just kind of explain a little bit about why your resume might not look average.
Okay. That
If you
makes a lot of
don't
sense.
have those kind of
Yeah.
transitions, I would say maybe use that space for something else. You don't necessarily need it.
Yeah. Yeah. I now now that you share that, that makes so much more sense as far as the context of why that advice was being provided to me, because I went
Mm,
from a long career in the world of personal finance, and I ended up
mm,
going to IT services was the other world I ultimately ended up in. But it was whenever I was applying for anything that was really outside of the world of finance, it was include a story, because then you could kind of highlight the skills that you acquired within that industry and that career, and how it's like relatable to that new position. Is that kind of what you would suggest?
absolutely.
Yeah,
I think
cool.
the thing you need to think about for that summary is that it needs to be really short.
Yeah,
So I wouldn't include more than just a couple of lines, and the rest is really what you go to your cover letter to kind of highlight which skills you can use and how you'll all your previous um, experiences, how they'll be at value in more of a text form.
yeah.
But a couple of sentences to just explain your objectives and why this makes sense. Absolutely, that's a great way to
Okay.
use your summary.
It sounds like then your resume should probably be able to fit on one page.
Yes, your
Okay.
resume should. I mean, under very extraordinary circumstances, I would say it's more and more common. I would say like 5, 6 years ago, it'd be like no, it needs to be one page. Now it's a
Yeah.
little bit more loose, but I would definitely recommend to have it on one page.
Okay. And can someone use a basically a templated resume, as far as they could use that exact same resume if they're applying at multiple places? They could use the same resume, and then maybe the cover letter is the one that gets tailored and customized per role they're applying for? Or would you suggest they still customize and tailor the resumes?
That's a really good question. I love that you ask it. I always recommend that you tailor both of them.
Okay.
So you can definitely use a template as kind of a starting point. But then a lot of companies, they use something called an ATS, which is an automatic tracking system. So what I would recommend is that you really take your time to look at the ad if you're applying to a specific job that already exists, and look at the words that they're using.
Mm,
Look at how they describe what they're looking for and see how you can fit that into your resume.
right. It's like
And it's
search
also
engine optimization.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly how it works. They will
Yeah.
have, machines that actually look for the words that they have set beforehand, that this is what we're looking for.
Interesting.
So make sure to tailor your resume, because that may be actually, if that may be the deal breaker if you even get looked at for your resume.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's shift to a different section that normally is included in that initial application. So the cover letter.
Yeah.
My understanding of a cover letter, because I've been fortunate enough where I haven't had to do a lot of resumes and cover letters. I've gotten a lot
Mm.
of my jobs just in different kinds of ways. But um, so you kind of touched on it briefly there, but the cover letter is meant to expand on the story. Is that the purpose of the cover letter?
Yeah, so for me, I think so. The first thing to be clear about is that, recruiting is a little bit subjective. So, but for me as a recruiter, absolutely, yes. I want to see who you are in your cover letter. Your resume is what gets my attention, and then your cover letter is what really seals the deal. Like,
Mm,
who are you as a person and what are you bringing to the table? And so, one of the mistakes I see most often is that people just go over their resume, but in wording instead, in the cover letter. So they just repeat what I already know.
hmm.
And so that's what I would recommend that you don't do. It's fine to go over your experiences, but tell me how they contribute to your story. Tell me how you got there. Tell me why this is important and how these experiences are going to help you in this job.
Right.
Tell me why you want this job. Um, and also, I would say try to have most of your focus on what you're going to contribute versus how good this job is going to be for you and your career. Because I already know that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's good advice. So now we're at that stage. The person has their resume super dialed in. They've got great cover letters. they're submitting their applications to all the desirable jobs that they're looking for, and they get that call back for the interview. What would be is there anything, I guess, in between that resume submission and the callback to actually doing the interview? Is there anything that you would suggest they be aware of, or any next steps that they should take, or is it really just next step is the interview?
I would take a look at your online presence.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, actually.
This is something that is becoming more and more common, to just kind of, we check each other out online. And so take a look at your LinkedIn profile, take a look at every other online presence you have, and make sure that that is something that you would be comfortable with the recruiter knowing, because they do check you out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Facebook, obviously, I would assume would be one of the, Facebook and LinkedIn, I would guess, would be probably the first two that they would look at. And then maybe they'll go to Twitter or Instagram or all those other ones. But that would be my guess. So what your suggestion, I'm really glad you brought this up, is in advance to probably even applying, is clean up your social profiles so that it's a positive representation of who you are. So that's obviously key. And then it also echoes whatever it is that you're trying to share as your story professionally. LinkedIn probably more so than Facebook. But yeah, I really like that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously most recruiters recognize that Facebook and Instagram are usually personal and more private, like geared towards that. But definitely look at your LinkedIn and make sure that that is representative of what you want to communicate.
Right. You'd also, I think you'd mentioned this earlier, but personal websites. So is that something you recommend people go and do, or would their LinkedIn profile probably suffice for those purposes?
I think it depends a little bit. If you're in the creative field, like say that you're applying for you're looking for web designer jobs or stuff like that, I would definitely recommend it, because it's such a great way to show your portfolio.
Right.
If you're looking for like finance jobs and so on, it might be less necessary, but I like to see a personal website. I wouldn't say that it's like a deal breaker in any way, but it's a nice add-on. But
right, it's like it scores bonus points. It's not a requirement, but it scores bonus points.
Yeah.
And I think in the situation that a lot of people are finding themselves right now as we speak, and perhaps even going forward, if there's as many people, there's the amount of people that are going to be unemployed, it makes it very competitive, right? So anything you can do to give yourself those bonus points, like a website or a very polished LinkedIn profile, is probably gonna it can't hurt. Right.
Exactly. And it's, this kind of is showing us that more and more things are happening online, and it seems like a natural, I mean, I can't tell the future, but now that we're all stuck at home and more companies are working online, your online presence is more than ever. It's important. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So we've got resume, cover letter. They're dialed in now. Their online profile, nice and clean, looks super professional. Now it's interview time. I know a lot of people are very intimidated by that process and get anxiety around it. What would be some advice for them to help them get through that process as best as possible, even if they are especially actually if they are that kind of person that has a bit of anxiety around it?
Right. Well, I think obviously practice. There are a lot of, well, actually, like that can help so much if you practice answering your questions. Me as a recruiter, I used to really love asking the big open questions. So like just starting off with like, okay, tell me who you are. And that question is great for me because it opens up so much for my candidate to just take it in whichever way.
Right.
And it can be great for the candidate as well because it gives you a lot of control to go in whichever direction. But if you haven't practiced it, that can be really tough. How do you answer that? So tell me who you are. That's,
Yeah. It is a tough question. I recently had to go through an interview process, and that was actually their very first question when I sat down with them.
Mm,
And I kind of sat there and I thought, and I was like, okay, well, that's a really good question. And in my mind, I'm going like, I can literally go anywhere with this. So I was like, where should
mm,
I go? And the way I framed my response, and I'd love your feedback on this as far as whether this is an approach that you think people should take, is I had two stories basically to share. I had my professional tell me about yourself answer, and then I had
mhm,
a personal. So I was able to highlight both, right? So I went
mm,
through my career, which was really just a summary of what they should probably already know based on my cover letter and my resume. But then I share the personal side because I feel that's who they are ultimately going to hire, is if they personally like me, right?
yeah.
Because they called me to the interview because they kind of professionally like what they see, but now they want to get to know me, and so
Mm.
that's the approach I took. Would that be, in your professional opinion, would that be a nice way to respond to that, or maybe something different? What would you think?
Well, personally, I love that response because it tells me something about you. Like you choosing to present both and like that is important to you. That tells me a lot about who I'm going to be getting uh, for that job. It's not just what you have done and what you're actually performing, but it's also about who you are as a person and you bring your personal side to it. So for me as a recruiter, it tells me something about what's important to you and, bringing your whole self to work. So I would say that works definitely.
Awesome.
It's
Well,
going to
there you
be
go.
it's going to be different for everyone though. And so
For sure.
whatever choice someone goes with, it's going to give me something to go off
Right.
of.
But really, at the end of it, it's just as long as, because I think everybody should expect that kind of question. Maybe not worded that way, but it's going to be similar type of question. So having something prepared to share is more important than whether it's professional and personal, kind of like I did, but it's just more being prepared for it, is your advice, right?
Yeah, I think so. If you just go online and search for, prep for an interview, you're going to get like multitude of questions. And I would actually just recommend that you take them and you take the time to think about those questions. You may not get that exact question, but you may get something that's similar, and then you've already started thinking about it.
Right.
Because that's also something, if we go through our lives and, we're employed, we're at the same job, we might not ask those reflective questions a lot. So it's just a way to get yourself thinking about it.
Right. And there are a couple of questions that are quite common, like you said, going online and just finding those common ones and practicing them. There's one
Yeah.
question, or I guess it's two questions that tend to come up quite regularly, that love your perspective on the kind of answers that you're looking for or hoping to get. But tell me, it's the question of like, tell me a time that you had a difficult situation and how you handled it. Or
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I think people phrase it in a way of like, tell me some of your strengths or your weaknesses or whatever it is. So what is it
Mm-hmm.
that recruiters are looking for in that kind of response? Because I feel like people could really, pardon my language here, but BS them their way through that kind of
Right.
answer. But is there something in particular that recruiters are looking for with those questions?
Well, they can phrase it very differently, but yeah, like you said, it's very common to like ask about strengths and maybe weaknesses. And what we're looking for is, your awareness, how aware you are of your strengths and your weaknesses, and how you actually work with them. Because we're not assuming that you're Superman or that you're flawless. Quite the opposite. I would be worried if someone didn't know anything that they're not particularly strong at. So what I'm looking for there is to see, okay, when this shows up for you, how do you react? And how do you work with it? Like, I want to see someone who is aware and who is working to get better or to grow. So it's more about the potential of actually dealing with it.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So are there any other aspects of the interview process that you would want to share some advice on that I may be missing or overlooking?
Well, I was thinking about what you said about this being nervous. And one thing that can just be something to consider is you don't have to have the perfect answers. It's okay to take some time and like think about it, because sometimes I have candidates who are very nervous and they just blurt out something because they just want to give me something. And I almost want to stop them and be like, do you want to think about this? Because that's okay.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily make a bad impression if you take a second and like, oh, that's a good question. You could even repeat the question back and let it sink in. And just, think about your answers. It will, if anything, show that you're thoughtful about how you speak.
Right. Which will say a lot about how you would operate, I feel, right? Because if you're the type of person that when under pressure, because that's kind of the situation, you just kind of blurt out responses, it shows that you're a little bit more on the reactive side, which may not necessarily be what the employer is looking for, because they're going to go, well, if you're going to react to situations like that, you're not taking the time to think about how to actually handle the situation. You're just reacting to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So coming out of the interview process, so now we've helped our audience nail everything up to this point. What's the next step? What's the recommended next step after an interview? Is it sit and wait? Usually the recruiter tends to say, like, we'll get back to you in 2-3 days, whatever it is. And is there any suggestions post interview as far as like maybe sending them a thank you message or something like that?
Yeah, so a good recruiter will tell you the process so that you know what kind of times to expect and so on. I would always recommend to send a thank you letter just for meeting the person. Jobs, this is at the core all about building relationships. So even if this doesn't go all the way, cultivating a good relationship with the recruiter or, the hiring manager or whoever you met is still going to be valuable no matter what. So to kind of follow up with that, I think it shows a really nice gesture. Yeah, for sure.
Right. Cool. And then, so I guess now in the perfect scenario, a couple days goes by, the company calls back and says, hey, we're excited to extend an offer and we'd love to have you kind of jump on board.
That's a quick process.
Well, ideally, right? Like I said, it's the ideal situation. So going through that process though, is there anything that did I miss anything that you would want to add and help the audience with?
Well, what I would say is that can definitely be the case, that you have an interview and then you get an offer. It's quite common to go through different types of testing or have a case interview or have some type of follow-up, maybe a panel interview or something like that. So going out from the interview, I would recommend that you have the process clear so that you know what to expect. And again, if there are more steps, it's not something that's very uncommon. And to just prepare for those separately.
Mm-hmm. That is true. I had multiple interviews for this last position, and I've done the case studies and the answering tests and those types of things. But every company is different. I feel like after that first interview, so it's hard to. I feel like it would be really difficult or a very long episode for us to kind of cover all the different paths after it. I feel like everything that you've shared though up until that point of the interview, which has been like prepare, make yourself presentable. Like there's all that stuff becomes applicable later on in the process anyways. So if they're doing those things up front, they're going to continue doing them on the back end and I believe they'll be successful.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. So obviously we covered a lot as far as the whole journey of really looking for new employment or a career change. And it started really with the mindset and asking yourself why and or what your pursuit should be or you want it to be. And then we got into like the more tactical things of the cover letters and the resumes and whatnot, all the way to the interview process. But coming out of that, I always like to ask my guests, what's that one thing though that you would suggest the audience take action on so that they can level up and increase their chances of getting that job or career that they're looking for?
Right. So I really like to go back to the mindset, and I think it's particularly important in these days, like kind of what you mentioned, we're kind of in this unprecedented time where it's so much uncertainty. A lot of us are scared for, good reason. And if you've lost your job or if you're thinking about changing to something else, there's a lot of fear that comes into it. And so what I would advise you to do is to stop for a second and just think about where you're making your decisions from. Because making your decisions from a place of fear is going to give you a completely different result than making them from a place of, say, possibility. Mm. So there are different ways that you can approach this job seeking process. And coming at it from fear is it's automatically going to, narrow your vision. It's going to make you go for different things. And so it's completely normal, but it's still not something that I would recommend. So my advice is to kind of try to shift your perspective in that and try to come from possibility instead.
Right. I think that's very good advice, regardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not.
Exactly.
But yeah, no, I really appreciate that. So Cassandra, where can people find you online or connect with you if they wanted to reach out and or learn more about you?
Yeah, so I have a website at CassandraCarlsson.com. So that's spelled with a C and two S's and O-N because I'm Swedish. And I'm also on LinkedIn and on Instagram as well at cassandra.c.coaching.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure to include all those in the show notes. Great. Well, it was an absolute pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation a lot, and I know the audience is going to take a lot of value out of this, especially during this time. But even Amazing. Going forward, it's such it's really an evergreen topic, in my opinion, because people are always going through that kind of challenge when it comes to career and what they want to do.
For sure.
And especially if they got stuck in a career for a long time and they haven't done an interview or mm-hmm. application process in a while. This is such great advice for them. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks again and take care.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for listening to the Get Coached podcast. If you're looking for more information, you can head over to our website, which is getcoachedpodcast.com. You'll find the show notes for this and every other episode there. And if getting actionable advice every week from professional coaches is something you want more of, then make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes.